Opening the center immediately. This pawn launch aims for rapid piece development and early tactical opportunities. Embracing the Sicilian defense. This flank pawn boldly challenges central control, initiating a dynamic, unbalanced struggle from the outset. Developing a knight to eye the center is a classic way to prepare for pawn advances and exert early influence. Shielding the queen's path while preparing a pawn advance to challenge central influence. Opening the center aggressively. d4 immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to unleash white's pieces for rapid development and attacking prospects. Opening the center for piece play. This exchange immediately seeks active development and challenges the opponent's central pawn structure. Asserting central control. This knight boldly occupies a critical square, challenging black's pawn structure and opening avenues for piece development. Initiating piece development while challenging the central knight. This move sets the stage for a dynamic Sicilian defense battle. Reinforcing the central knight establishes immediate control over key squares, preparing for further development and potential kingside pressure. Preparing nc6 without allowing nd5 is a common prophylactic measure, subtly influencing central pawn structures. Unleashing a pin on the knight immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares for potential piece exchanges, aiming to disrupt black's development and create imbalances. Preparing to challenge the knight's central presence. Black repositions for development while subtly reinforcing the queenside. A common theme in this Sicilian variation where early pawn advances can lead to tactical skirmishes. Prying open lines for the kingside attack. White boldly stakes a claim in the center, preparing to expand and pressure black's developing pieces. Securing the queen behind the pawn shield. Black prepares for the looming storm on the kingside, subtly eyeing the d4 knight and preparing to challenge white's central ambitions. Capturing the knight on f6 immediately disrupts black's pawn structure, creating doubled and isolated pawns on the kingside, which will prove a long-term weakness for black to defend. Exposing your king's safety to the g-file opens a dangerous pathway for white's attack. Consider how the pawn structure now dictates a less secure home for your monarch. Developing the bishop here to e2 seeks to castle quickly and consolidate white's central pawn majority while aiming to exploit the weakened kingside dark squares that black has created. Developing the knight to c6 now reinforces the d4 square and opens up the c8 bishop, preparing for potential kingside castling and creating a more solid central structure. Although the doubled pawns on the f-file do present some positional considerations. Sharpening the attack. White eyes the kingside and prepares to hoist the rooks, aiming to exploit the structural weaknesses black has accepted for piece activity. A dynamic trade-off indeed. Black solidifies their pawn structure and prepares to castle kingside, though the doubled f-pawns create a long-term structural weakness that will need careful maneuvering to compensate for. Unleashing the kingside castle opens a dynamic avenue for the rooks, aiming to exploit the compromised kingside pawn structure black has accepted. A bold attempt to disrupt white's queenside castling. This pawn thrust immediately challenges the structural integrity of white's kingside pawn chain and aims to generate counterplay on the queenside or even directly attack the relocated king. Shielding the king from potential diagonal threats. This king's retreat secures the monarch behind the pawn chain, creating a safer haven and preparing the rook to potentially join the queenside attack on the newly opened file, while simultaneously acknowledging the positional concession of allowing black to establish a strong pawn presence on the kingside. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming towards white's kingside potential, is a sensible idea here. This maneuver prepares for potential future development, perhaps swinging the bishop over to the g7 square to pressure white's castled king. Or alternatively, offering support for a d5 pawn push later in the game. Black is shoring up the defense of the e7 square, preventing any immediate tactical incursions by white's pieces. It's a move that emphasizes developing pieces towards the center and potentially creating attacking chances, while also ensuring solid defensive coverage. The bishop finds a more active diagonal, eyeing squares that were previously out of reach, potentially preparing a queenside expansion or supporting a future kingside attack. Striking at white's central knight opens avenues and addresses the immediate pressure, though it does invite doubled pawns and alters black's pawn structure, a significant positional concession for increased activity. Opening the queen to the d-file. This move immediately challenges black's central presence and aims to exploit the doubled pawns on the f-file, creating a potential target for future pressure. Embracing the chaotic embrace of the queenside castling. Black immediately confronts the central tension, daring white's monarch to weather the storm developing along the open files. Initiating a daring pawn thrust, white seeks to shatter the defensive structure around black's king and open lines for the queen and rook, creating immediate attacking pressure on the kingside. A crucial repositioning to guard the exposed king, sacrificing crucial queenside space to avoid immediate tactical complications and seeking a more secure defensive posture. White attempts to regain the initiative on the queenside, though this retreat might concede precious tempo and allow black's pieces to better coordinate their defensive and offensive potential. A daring pawn push, intending to pry open the kingside and possibly trap the white queen. Shifting the knight to e2 aims to reinforce the king's sanctuary and potentially prepare a knight maneuver to the queenside, offering a defensive posture against black's encroaching pawn storm on the kingside initiated by h5. Initiating a counter-offensive by rerouting the bishop aims to reinforce the queenside's defensive structure and potentially prepare for a later pawn push on the b-file, as the black king remains exposed on the queenside. Opening the f-file immediately creates dynamic possibilities, potentially exposing the black king's defenses and forcing black to react to the immediate pressure. On the kingside, embracing the doubled f-pawns creates a double-edged sword, potentially unlocking the g-file for a swift assault but simultaneously exposing your monarch to increased pressure. A stark positional gamble. Unlocking the king's defense. This knight jumps into a more active post, aiming to disrupt black's castled position and exert pressure on the e6 pawn. Observe how white's pieces are starting to coordinate, with the knight potentially supporting a follow-up advance or simply becoming a thorn in black's side, forcing defensive adjustments. Harnessing the open g-file. This maneuver aims to activate the rook and exert immediate pressure on white's somewhat exposed kingside. The challenge for black now is to transition from a defensively sound but potentially passive pawn structure to a more dynamic attacking posture. Consider the interplay of the rooks and the potential for pawn breaks. White's king, though castled, has a somewhat compromised pawn shield, and the concentration of black's pieces along the g-file could exploit this in short order. Keep an eye on the coordination of your minor pieces to support this rook's initiative. Refocusing the queen to the e-file potentially aims to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king or prepare a battery with the bishop should it find a more active square, while simultaneously creating a pathway for the rook on d2 to re-enter the action. Injecting a new layer of complexity. This rook maneuver aims to activate the piece potentially exploiting the open G-file for future aggression or preparing a defensive redeployment. Shifting the rook to d3 aims to reinforce the kingside pawn storm potential, allowing the queen to potentially reposition and prepare for a central breakthrough, all while keeping a watchful eye on the open c-file should black choose to exploit it. An aggressive pawn push looms, forcing the bishop to a defensive posture, potentially exposing the king later. Opening the d-file now offers a direct path for your rook to join the attack, potentially creating immediate pressure on black's somewhat exposed king position. The bishop vacates its post on e7, aiming to reinforce the kingside defense and potentially prepare for a knight sortie on the g-file, while also creating a tactical avenue that could pressure the unprotected white knight on f4. White is consolidating the knight, repositioning it to a potentially more active square on the kingside where it might participate in future attacks or defensively support the kingside if black's initiative shifts. The pawns are marching forward with aggressive intent, creating a complex pawn structure that opens lines and generates imbalances. Consider how the open h-file might become a significant factor in the near future. However, pushing the pawn so far forward now might expose your king to potential discovered attacks. Sacrificing space on the kingside by advancing the g-pawn, white aims to disrupt black's attacking potential and create a more solid pawn structure, even at the cost of creating weaknesses around their own monarch. This maneuver subtly repositions the rook, aiming to exploit the now open h-file as a potential conduit for attack or defense, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn chain structure on the queenside, a quiet but important defensive consolidation. Unleashing a tactical storm, this queen repositioning gambits an initiative, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and create a decisive pawn avalanche on the kingside. Unleashing a powerful central presence. This rook seizure on the 5th rank immediately challenges white's control over the open d-file and prepares to exploit the awkward placement of the white queen, potentially forcing it to retreat and allowing black to regroup their forces. Unlocking the central files by forcing a potential pawn exchange is the primary goal here, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for your pieces. Initiating a central pawn push feels bold, yet it might be exposing your king to unforeseen tactics by sacrificing pawn structure for minor gains. Focusing on the kingside pawn structure now becomes paramount as you try to solidify your position and prepare for potential breakthroughs. Unlocking the dark squared bishop's potential demands a delicate balancing act, and this repositioning aims to do just that, seeking a more active diagonal and potentially rerouting for an assault on white's king. Stabilizing the queenside by reinforcing the b2 pawn opens a crucial avenue for white's rook on the now less pressured queenside, aiming to connect pieces and potentially challenge black's advanced pawn structure. Swapping the rooks across the board, black initiates a daring maneuver to reposition their defensive asset, aiming to activate the rook currently pinned on the c-file and potentially exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure. Pondering a retreat of the queen back to the f2 square seems to acknowledge the lost initiative and seeks a safer haven, rather than confronting the burgeoning threats on the queenside or reinforcing the weakened kingside. The bishop's embarkation on an unexpected diagonal creates a dynamic reshuffling of black's defensive structure, clearing the path for the queen to potentially join the kingside assault after black's repeated pawn advances opens up new attacking avenues, forcing a re-evaluation of the pressure along the g-file. A bold thrust aiming to shatter the pawn structure and unlock diagonal pressure against the beleaguered king. though it also invites potential tactical complications on the open d-file. Unleashing a devastating kingside attack. White opens critical lines with this capture, aiming to expose black's monarch and exploit the weakened pawn structure created by the earlier pawn advances. The absorption of the pawn opens a diagonal for the black queen, potentially revitalizing her presence on the kingside, while simultaneously exposing the white king to a newfound diagonal pressure. Reclaiming the bishop from its defensive post on e4 immediately enhances white's attacking potential, creating a strong diagonal presence and preparing for further pressure on black's kingside. Unleashing the bishop to g7 offers a new attacking perspective, eyeing that exposed kingside and potentially bolstering the defense of the d5 pawn by making it less of a target. It's a calculated risk, aiming to inject activity into black's position where white's pieces, particularly the knight on e2, seem somewhat misplaced, opening up a diagonal for the bishop. The white queen's redeployment to g2 hints at preparing a more active role for the queen, potentially supporting a kingside initiative or reinforcing central control. Unlocking the dark-squared bishop's influence by pushing the f-pawn opens up diagonal avenues, but it simultaneously exposes your king to potential future attacks along that very diagonal and the now partially weakened kingside. Opening the queenside flank to challenge black's pawn chain and potentially create new avenues of attack after a period of positional maneuvering. Reinvigorating the initiative, black boldly surges the rook forward, seeking to disrupt white's seemingly secure queenside structure and exploit the exposed nature of white's king. Opening the c-file with this advance offers a vital avenue for your rook to penetrate black's queenside, potentially creating immediate pressure on the weak pawns and forcing concessions from the defender. Unleashing a pawn storm onto the central files. Black aims to shatter white's pawn structure and exploit the newly opened lines for their pieces, creating a dynamic imbalance that could prove decisive if white missteps. The knight repositions, eyeing the potentially exposed black king and creating a springboard for future action. The rook's redeployment to the fourth rank aims to disrupt white's queen and potentially exploit the open c-file, but it neglects the lurking danger presented by the knight's potential leap to f5, which could create serious threats against black's king. Asserting dominance over the open c-file and pinning black's bishop, this bishop move immediately creates serious pressure on the queenside and prepares to exploit potential weaknesses around the black king. Unleashing the rook to the 8th rank initiates a bold attempt to break through the beleaguered white defenses, aiming to exploit the exposed king and potentially create decisive counterplay along the open file. The queen's repositioning to g2 seeks to re-establish attacking pressure along the g-file, aiming to pry open lines towards black's king after the previous maneuvers. Seizing the open c-file with this maneuver injects immediate dynamism, threatening to unravel white's pawn structure and exploit the now exposed c3 square. Recapturing the pawn is a necessary step, reclaiming material and initiating a phase where white must solidify their position rather than continue the aggressive pawn storm. The queen's recapture, while seemingly obvious, opens up the diagonal for white's bishop and creates a dangerous attacking potential around black's king. This seemingly simple exchange introduces critical attacking lines that black must now carefully navigate. Navigating this complex position demands white reclaim central influence after black's queen sacrifice, aiming to consolidate the pawn deficit by activating pieces rather than passively reacting to black's threats. The queen's retreat to c7 seems like a tactical regrouping, aiming to protect the e7 bishop and potentially prepare for further queen activity on the queenside. Perhaps supporting a pawn push or simply finding a safer square after the recent exchanges. A bold attempt to seize control of the queenside. This knight maneuver aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially pry open lines for an attack, unleashing a pawn storm onto the white king's defenses. This advance ignites critical tactical complications, aiming to shatter white's pawn structure and create opportunities for aggressive piece play. The knight's bold leap to c4 initiates a fascinating positional struggle, aiming to control the crucial d6 square and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure while creating attacking opportunities on the queenside. The knight's audacious leap to the edge of the board signals a bold attempt to disrupt white's attacking setup by targeting the d-file, aiming to stir up complications and potentially create counterplay for black's rook. Unlocking the queen's diagonal opens up a dynamic assault on the exposed black king, exploiting the pin on the rook along the d-file and threatening immediate tactical fireworks. Accepting the queen trade simplifies the position dramatically, forcing an endgame where black's king safety is a paramount concern. But the remaining pawns offer potential counterplay if white isn't precise. Pawns suddenly take center stage, their structural integrity now a pressing concern after that sharp exchange. The newly crowned king, now exposed on the 7th rank, can only watch as the remaining pawns become paramount in this endgame. The knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to bolster the pawn chain and potentially participate in a kingside assault or support a central pawn advance. The bishop repositions to threaten the pawn on e4 and the weakened kingside diagonal, hinting at a potential breakthrough once the queens are exchanged. Reclaiming the open file offers a crucial lifeline, aiming to destabilize black's increasingly aggressive pawn structure and potentially launch a counter-offensive. Returning the bishop to f8 now is a critical defensive decision, seeking to bolster the protection of the kingside pawns against the encroaching enemy rook and knight, while also preparing for potential complications on the kingside should white's pieces continue to advance aggressively. Asserting presence on the queenside. This pawn advance aims to solidify white's structure and prepare for potential breakthroughs or support for a distant passed pawn's advance. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside now, aiming to disrupt white's potentially solidified pawn structure and create some much-needed counterplay. Pushing the h-pawn here seems to be an attempt to gain space on the kingside and potentially create a passed pawn later, but it also exposes white's king to further scrutiny along the open files. Snatching that pawn on a4 opens up the a-file, potentially bringing your rook into play and creating an immediate target on the queenside while white's king remains somewhat exposed. Capitalizing on the open file. This repositioning aims to activate the rook on the queenside, threatening to penetrate black's weakened pawn structure and exert pressure on the remaining kings. Defenders. The bishop's reappearance on an open diagonal, after what felt like an eternity on the back rank, suddenly injects a potent threat against white's uncastled monarch, forcing a reassessment of the immediate tactical possibilities. Opening the path for the rook to re-enter the fray. This move aims to exploit the precarious position of black's scattered pawns by creating dynamic counterplay, potentially pinning down black's active pieces. Rescuing the rook from its exposed outpost is paramount, preventing its capture and potentially setting up a counterplay on the newly opened b-file. Pawns march forward, creating a dizzying web of potential discoveries and forks, while the knight leaps into the fray, ready to exploit the king's exposed position. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal is a priority, aiming to exploit the exposed white king and create counterplay against the remaining pawn. Structure. Initiating a strategic repositioning. White's rook pivots from the open file, aiming to bolster the e-pawn's advance and potentially create defensive resources on the kingside. Black's bishop now vacates the diagonal, potentially preparing to redeploy to a more active square or support a pawn advance. Unleashing a powerful assault on the weak light squares. This maneuver seeks to exploit the exposed black king and disrupt any defensive cohesion. Initiating the creation of a passed pawn on the queenside. This maneuver seeks to expand black's space and potentially create dangerous offensive potential against white's otherwise solid structure. Clearing the path for the rook to attack the doubled pawns on the queenside offers a promising initiative. Challenging the bishop's dominion on the queenside aims to disrupt white's control and potentially activate black's rook. A decisive check, forcing the black king to a more exposed position and setting up potential mating nets. The monarch's flight path now appears precarious, forced to retreat as the powerful rook relentlessly advances, seeking to exploit any weakness. Seizing the open file with the rook can drastically alter the remaining pawn structure and create immediate threats against black's vulnerable king. The bishop retreats, seeking a safer haven from the relentless pressure of the rook and knight. But its repositioning allows white's monarch a crucial escape route, creating a delicate balance where neither side can afford to relax. Sensing a weakness, the rook aggressively probes the queenside, creating immediate threats against the isolated pawns and potentially disrupting the opponent's defense. The pawn pushing forward on e3 injects a dose of chaos into the position, directly challenging the knight on d5 and potentially opening lines for black's remaining pieces. The pawn's advance creates a new outpost, threatening to become a formidable piece if left unchecked, while simultaneously opening a path for potential infiltration should black's defenses falter. Sacrificing the bishop offers a last-ditch attempt to create an open path for the king, hoping to disrupt white's material advantage and potentially complicate the endgame with a passed pawn. Sacrificing the bishop to eliminate black's attacking pawn and open lines for white's rooks creates a dynamic imbalance, potentially leading to a decisive advantage if white can coordinate their remaining pieces effectively. The unexpected recapture on d5 ushers in a crucial phase where white's king's safety becomes a paramount concern given the exposed position and black's active rook. The endgame has been dramatically simplified, and your rook now stands alone, confronting a dispersed enemy force. The monarch, now exposed, desperately seeks refuge from the impending check on the now open first rank. The monarch scurries for cover, seeking refuge from the storm of attacking pieces, as the rook pair now threatens to dominate the central files. Sensing an immediate threat after the king's exposed position, black prioritizes defending the vulnerable monarch by repositioning the rook to a more active, yet defensive, role on the open file. Unleashing a decisive check, white forces the black king into a precarious corner, setting the stage for a swift conclusion and demonstrating how relentless pressure on the weakened back rank can shatter even the most resilient defense. Black's monarch is now precariously exposed on the edge of the board, a consequence of the earlier pawn push, and must desperately seek shelter as the enemy rook cuts off escape routes. The rook's march to the 8th rank seals the king's fate by creating an unavoidable mating net. The pawn storm on the queenside gains momentum, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's defensive structure. Advancing the pawn on the h-file initiates a decisive pawn race, aiming to promote before black's bishop can neutralize the threat. A final, desperate check to lure the white king out into the open. Unlocking the potential of that open file is paramount. Aiming to centralize the monarch offers a vital defensive pivot and prepares for potential pawn advances. Exploiting the exposed white king. The knight's forced relocation opens the door for a decisive attack. The rook's repositioning opens up a path to contest the central files, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and creating dynamic possibilities. Pushing the pawn forward aims to create further dynamism on the queenside, potentially opening a path for the bishop or threatening to outmaneuver the opponent's pieces into passive positions.